The ship came out of fold space the way a needle comes through cloth. Quiet. No announcement. The unbroken meridian held position at the dark edge of the solar system and ran its eyes over everything. Vial 9 sat in the analysis chamber and did his job. He was good at his job. 22 years of planetary surveys. 43 worlds catalogued, assessed, filed. He had a method. The method worked. He followed the method the way water follows a drain. Not because he chose to, but because that was simply what water did. He pulled up the intake display and began. 1 star. Yellow-white. Middle-aged. Stable. 8 planets. Rocky inner system, gas giants out wide. Standard formation. Nothing unusual. 1 inhabited world. 3rd from the sun. He zoomed in. Nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere. Carbon-based life. Surface temperature range within the biological tolerance band. Liquid water on approximately 71% of the surface. Green land masses. White cloud cover. Blue oceans. He typed his first notation, visually unremarkable. Then he typed the population count, 8 billion units. He paused on the number for half a second. Not because it surprised him, 8 billion was not unusual for a world this age. But because he always paused at the population number. It was the one moment where the survey stopped feeling like geometry and started feeling like something else. He never named the something else. He moved past it. He began the surface scan. He was looking for the standard things. Agricultural zones spreading out from population centers like veins from a heart. Trade routes. Road systems. The soft infrastructure of a civilization that had not yet learned there was anything beyond its own sky. He expected the usual picture. A planet that had grown fat and comfortable on its own resources. Squabbling with itself over small borders. Completely unaware that anything was watching. He had seen this picture 43 times. He began to compose it in his mind before the data finished loading. The data finished loading. He looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. The agricultural zones were there. The road systems were there. But they were threaded through with something else. Something that ran under and over and between all the soft civilian infrastructure like a second skeleton inside a body. Harder. Denser. Built for a different purpose entirely. 4,500 military installations. Active. Maintained. Steph. He ran the count again. Same number. He cross-referenced against the Empire's database of pre-contact civilizations. In the entire recorded history of the Empire, across 1,400 worlds, the average number of active military installations found on a pre-contact world at this stage of development was 31. 31. He sat with the number 4,500 for a moment. Then he kept reading. 13 separate governing bodies on the surface. They called them nations. Each with independently confirmed nuclear payload capacity. Not 1. Not 2. 13. Nuclear-capable powers on a world that had not yet left its own solar system in any meaningful way. He pulled the timeline. They had developed nuclear weapons 81 years ago. He stopped. In the Empire's records, 6 species in history had achieved nuclear capability before first contact. He knew this number without looking it up. 6. It was one of the first things new analysts were taught because it was one of the most important data points in the field. 6 species. And of those 6, 3 had destroyed themselves with the weapons within a generation of building them. The other 3 had been too frightened of what they had made to use the weapons on each other. They had held the weapons at arm's length, terrified, until the Empire arrived and took the weight off their hands. Earth had had nuclear weapons for 81 years. They were still there. He pulled the conflict data. 37 ongoing armed conflicts. Active right now while he was watching. Across a single land mass they called a continent. One continent. Not even the whole planet. 37 separate wars running at the same time. His scan moved south. Another continent. More conflicts. Different flags. Different weapons. Same human bodies in the same human dirt. He moved his scan to the northern regions. Tensions. Deployments. Troop movements along borders drawn and redrawn so many times the ground beneath them barely remembered its original shape. He sat back in his chair. The intake protocol had a specific section for threat assessment. He was supposed to fill it in now. He was supposed to assign a number between 1 and 10. Being no threat, 10 being immediate danger to survey vessel. He opened the section. He looked at it. He pulled up the conflict history instead. He read for a long time. They had been fighting for as long as they had been writing things down. Before that, based on archaeological data, they had been fighting for longer. The weapons changed. The borders changed. The names of the wars changed. The wars themselves did not stop. He found a war that had ended approximately 108 years ago. It had lasted 4 years. It had killed 17 million people in that time. 17 million. He pulled up the record of the 23rd world the Empire had acquired. A world he had surveyed himself 6 years ago. A quiet place with gentle people who had cried when the Empire ships arrived. The total population of that world had been 14 million. He closed that file. He opened his threat assessment section again. He typed the number 6. He looked at it. He deleted it. He typed it again. When he moved to the next section, the technology assessment took him 3 hours. He went through it carefully, methodically, without feeling, applying the same standards he applied to every world. Their ships could not reach other star systems. Their fastest probes would take tens of thousands of years to reach the nearest star at current speeds. By any standard metric of spacefaring capability, they were primitive. But their weapons were not primitive. They had built weapons for every environment on their own planet. Weapons that worked in extreme cold. Weapons that worked in extreme heat. Weapons that worked underwater. Weapons designed for the specific atmospheric conditions found in high mountain altitudes. Weapons built to function after being buried in mud for weeks. And they had weapons rated. He checked the translation twice to make sure he had it right. Rated to remain operational after a nuclear detonation within 5 kilometers of the user. A weapon designed to survive a nuclear detonation. He read that specification 3 times. He moved on. Their military doctrine was the thing that took the longest. He pulled texts, manuals, strategic frameworks, thousands of years of recorded military thinking. He found one text that was particularly old, several thousand years. A civilization that no longer existed had written it. The civilization was gone. The text was still in use. Current militaries on the planet still taught it. He read the text in 40 seconds. He read it again. It was about deception, about patience, about making your enemy fight the war you had prepared for rather than the war they intended to fight, about turning weakness into a false front and strength into a hidden thing. He set the text aside. He opened his personal log. He had kept a personal log for 11 years. His supervisors did not know about it. It was not against regulations. There were no regulations about personal logs because the Empire had never imagined its analysts would feel the need for one. He typed, "The text is several thousand years old. The civilization that wrote it no longer exists. The text is still used." He thought about what that meant for a moment. He typed, "They outlived their own philosophers and kept the philosophy." He closed the log and went back to work. By the end of the first day, he had a picture. It was not the picture he had expected. He had expected a soft world. Round and yielding. The kind of world the Empire's advanced fleets processed the way a machine processes grain. Fed in one side, resource-rich and compliant. Extracted from the other side, sorted and useful. This world was not that picture. This world was a world that had been running a war college for 10,000 years. And the students had never graduated because the school never closed. He began writing the preliminary report. He wrote the standard sections. Population, technology, atmosphere, resource value, high, very high. The mineral deposits alone would justify the acquisition cost several times over. He wrote that section carefully. He knew his supervisors read the resource section first. He reached the threat assessment narrative section. This was the part of the report where analysts were expected to give a qualitative summary of the risk involved in acquisition. He stared at the blank section for 6 minutes. Then he wrote, Asterisk species designation Earth 3 presents an anomalous threat index that requires further assessment before standard acquisition protocol can be recommended. Initial scan indicates military infrastructure density that falls outside normal parameters for pre-contact civilizations at this development stage. Conflict history is extensive and continuous. Nuclear capability confirmed in 13 independent governing bodies. Suggest expanded survey period before fleet deployment, asterisk. He saved the report. He filed it under preliminary. He opened his personal log again. He typed, I have been doing this for 22 years. I have surveyed 43 worlds. I have a method. The method has always been enough. He paused. The method assumes there is a soft part. He looked at the image of the planet on his display. Blue and green and white. Beautiful in the way a thing can be beautiful from far enough away that you cannot yet see what it is made of. The lights of the night side glittered through the dark. Millions of lit windows. Millions of vehicles. Millions of lives going about the business of being alive in the particular loud and tangled way this species went about everything. Somewhere in the feed, a building was burning. Somewhere else, in a different city, people were dancing in the street. He watched both at the same time for a while. He typed, they are fighting each other. They have always been fighting each other. They have not stopped. And they are still there. He sent the preliminary report to his supervisor on the command deck. Then he pulled up the conflict data again and kept reading. He read through the night cycle. 12 hours by the ship's internal clock, though the concept of night meant nothing this far from any star. He read about a war that had killed 50 million. He read about a different war that had killed 80 million. He read about a war where one side had deliberately flooded an entire region, drowning civilians and soldiers alike because the strategic math worked out in their favor. He found this last piece of information deeply troubling in a way he could not fully process. Not because of the cruelty, he had catalogued cruelty on other worlds, but because of the math. Because some human commander had looked at a map and a spreadsheet of bodies and decided the numbers balanced. And the decision had worked. And the side that made it had won. And the war had ended. And 50 years later, the civilization had rebuilt itself. The population had grown back. The economy had recovered. They had gone back to building things and arguing with each other and developing weapons and writing philosophy. They had won a war by drowning their own land. And then they had grown back. He opened his report again. He looked at the threat assessment section. He looked at the number 6 he had typed. He changed it to 7. He sat with that for a while. He changed it back to 6. He told himself it was because 6 was defensible with the current data. He told himself that 7 would require more documentation. He told himself that this was standard analytical practice. He almost believed himself. His supervisor sent a response to the preliminary report just before the end of the night cycle. It was brief. Continue survey. Confirm soft target status. He read it twice. He typed back, confirmed. Continuing survey. He opened his personal log. Supervisor has requested soft target confirmation. He thought about what to type next for a long time. I have not found the soft part yet. He looked at the planet. Still turning. Still burning in a few places. Still lit up in others. Still full of 8 billion units that were at this exact moment doing approximately 37 different kinds of violence to each other, and approximately 10,000 different kinds of everything else. Building. Cooking. Loving. Arguing. Sleeping. Waking. Driving. Running. Laughing at things he would never understand the humor of. He set the conflict data aside. He pulled up something different. Something his scan had tagged and filed as non-military, low priority. He had almost skipped it. It was a signal. A human signal. Not a broadcast. Not the kind of noise a civilization throws into the sky the way you throw bread to birds, hopeful and unaddressed. This was directed. Narrow beam. Aimed at a specific point in space. He checked the coordinates of that point. It was not a star. It was not a known astronomical feature. He ran the coordinates through the ship's navigation database. The breath, metaphorically speaking, because Vial 9 did not have breath in the biological sense, went out of him. The coordinates were approximate. Wrong by a margin that suggested the humans were working from inference rather than direct observation. But the direction was right. The direction was pointing, within a few degrees of error, at the last known position of an Empire survey ship. Not this survey ship. A different one. A ship that had passed through this system 11 years ago on a routine sweep. Filed a negative report. No significant civilization detected. No follow-up required. Moved on. A ship that had apparently not been as invisible as it thought. They had spotted something 11 years ago. Something small. Something easy to miss. And they had spent 11 years triangulating the direction it had come from. And now they were pointing a signal at that direction. Narrow and precise and deliberate like a finger. Not a greeting. Not a distress call. He ran the signal through the translation matrix. The language was mathematical. Ratios. Prime numbers. Geometric sequences. The universal vocabulary of civilization saying, "We know you are out there. We know approximately where. We have been watching." He sat with this information for a very long time. He opened his personal log. He typed nothing for several minutes. Then, they are scanning back. He closed the log. He pulled up the threat assessment section of his report one more time. He looked at the number 6. He did not change it, but his hand, four-fingered, precise, trained to certainty, hovered over the display for longer than it should have before he moved to the next section and kept working. He went deeper on the second day. That was the word he used in his log. Deeper. Not a word he normally used in professional contexts. Analysts did not go deeper. Analysts expanded the survey. They widened the data set. They followed the protocol to its next section. But the word that came to him, sitting in the analysis chamber with the planet's data filling his screens from edge to edge, was deeper. Like a thing you did not walk across but descended into. Like a well. Or a wound. He accessed their data networks first. The Empire had developed over centuries a set of tools for breaking into the communications infrastructure of pre-contact civilizations. The tools were very good. They were designed to work fast, because fast was what the Empire valued. Get in, get the data, get out, move to the next section of the survey. The tools hit the human networks and slowed down. Not because the humans had better encryption. They didn't. At least not everywhere. Some of their networks were wide open, broadcasting freely into the air, practically handing their data to anyone who reached for it. But they were layered in a way that was unusual. Open networks sitting beside heavily locked ones. Public information right next to something wrapped in cipher after cipher after cipher. A soft outer shell and a harder thing inside. And harder still the further you went. It took his tools 11 minutes to get through the secured layers. He noted this without expression. 11 minutes was longer than it should have been. He did not think about why he noted it. He began pulling the data. There was a great deal of it. A civilization of 8 billion left a large footprint in its own information systems. He was not interested in most of it. The entertainment. The commerce. The private communications of individuals going about their individual lives. He filtered for military, government, strategic infrastructure. What he found kept him in his chair for the next 6 hours without moving. Their military was not one thing. That was the first thing that struck him. In most civilizations, the military was a single structure. One organization. One chain of command. One doctrine flowing from the top down like water from a single source. Predictable. Easy to model. The human military was not one thing. It was 13 things roughly, one for each nation that had nuclear capability, plus dozens of smaller things nested inside those things, plus semi-independent organizations that crossed national borders, plus coalitions that existed for specific purposes and then dissolved and then reformed under different names. Each piece had its own doctrine, its own culture, its own way of thinking about war. And they cooperated. That was the part he could not easily process. They were separate. They competed with each other. They distrusted each other. He could see that in the communication logs, in the tone of diplomatic exchanges, in the history of alliances that had broken and been rebuilt. And despite all of that, they cooperated. Because they had each independently concluded that some problems were large enough that the competition had to pause. They had a word for this. A specific word in several of their languages. The concept it described was, "We are enemies, but this is bigger than that. He wrote the word in his personal log and stared at it. He had surveyed 43 worlds. He had never encountered a species that had institutionalized that concept. Every other species he had catalogued either unified under a single government or broke apart along the fault lines of their divisions. The humans had done neither. They had found a third option that should not have worked and made it work anyway. Imperfectly, held together with mutual distrust and the cold understanding that they needed each other. He did not have a category for this in his survey taxonomy. He moved on. He pulled the weapon specifications. He had seen their weapons from the surface scan, the installations, the hardware, the deployment patterns. Now he went into the technical documentation, the design files, the test records. The first thing he noticed was the age of the documentation. Some of their weapon systems were built on designs that were decades old. 50 years. 60. 70. Updated and refined and improved, but built on foundations laid by engineers who were long dead. Most civilizations discarded old weapon designs the way you discard old tools when better ones exist. The humans kept the old designs. They improved them. They found new uses for old principles. They were incapable, apparently, of deciding that something was fully obsolete. He found this inefficient. He found it unsettling in a way he could not immediately explain. The second thing he noticed was the environmental range. Standard weapons engineering across all civilizations optimized for the most common combat environment. You built weapons that worked well in the places you expected to fight. This was logical. This was efficient. Human weapons were not built this way. Their weapons were built for everywhere. He found weapons rated for operation in temperatures that would kill the humans themselves. Underwater weapon systems. High-altitude systems. Systems built to function in the electromagnetic chaos that came in the immediate aftermath of a nuclear detonation. He found weapons with redundant firing mechanisms. Redundant power supplies. Redundant targeting systems. As if the humans, every time they designed something, imagined the worst possible version of the situation it would be used in, and then designed for that version instead of the normal one. He found a material specification document for a standard infantry weapon. He read the requirements. The weapon had to function after being submerged in salt water for 72 hours. After being dropped from a height of 2 meters onto concrete. After being buried in sand. After being frozen solid and then thawed. After being exposed to direct flame for 30 seconds. He read that last requirement twice. They built their standard infantry weapon to survive being on fire. He sat back in his chair. He thought about the armies of the Empire. Well-equipped. Well-trained. Drilled for the environments they expected to encounter. Professional. Efficient. He thought about what it meant that the humans had looked at their own expected environments and concluded, everything. We expect to fight in everything. He moved to the doctrine files. This was where he spent the most time. Military doctrine, the thinking behind the weapons, the philosophy of how and why and when. To fight was what the Empire's strategic planners used to model conquest scenarios. You could have all the weapons in the world, but doctrine told you how a military would behave under pressure. Doctrine was the thing that either held or broke when the fighting got bad. He read for 4 hours. The doctrine files were old. Not just the current ones. He pulled historical doctrine, going back as far as the records went. He wanted to see how the thinking had changed. It had not changed as much as he expected. The weapons changed every generation. The technology changed. The tactics updated. But the underlying logic, the bones of how the humans thought about war, was surprisingly consistent across thousands of years of records. They thought about war as a continuous thing. Not an interruption of normal life that you endured until you could return to normal life. Not an event. A state. A permanent condition that you managed. That you prepared for always. That you assumed would come again in some form, even during the periods of relative quiet. They had a concept that translated roughly as peace is the time you use to get ready for the next war. He wrote this in his personal log. Then he wrote, "Every other civilization I have surveyed treats peace as the goal. For them, peace is the interruption." He stared at this. He closed the log and went back to the data. He found the old text again. the one several thousand years old. He had read it on the first day of the survey, but he returned to it now with different eyes. Now that he understood more about the context it had come from. A civilization under constant threat. Surrounded by rivals. Unable to afford the luxury of assuming tomorrow would look like today. The text said many things, but the thing he kept returning to was a single idea near the center of it. The idea was this: know your enemy. Know yourself. In 100 battles, you will not be defeated. He read it several times. Then he pulled a database of military doctrine from civilizations the Empire had conquered over the last 3 centuries. He searched for equivalent concepts. The idea of systematic self-knowledge as a strategic tool. The idea that understanding your own limitations was as important as understanding your enemies. He found partial equivalents in 4 civilizations. All 4 had offered significant resistance during acquisition, more than the initial surveys had projected. He noted this. He did not add it to the official survey report. He added it to his personal log instead, which was becoming, he realized, longer than any personal log he had kept on any previous survey. He told himself this was because this world was more complex. He told himself it was a function of the data volume. He was beginning to be slightly dishonest with himself, and he knew it, and he kept going anyway. He spent the afternoon on the conflict history. He had skimmed this on the first day. Now he read carefully. The wars were not what drew his attention. The wars were extensive and brutal and continuous, as he had already established. What drew his attention was what happened after each one. They rebuilt. Every time. Not slowly. Not gradually. Shockingly fast. He found a city that had been burned to its foundations by war and was a functioning metropolis again within 30 years. Entire regions that had been deliberately poisoned, soil contaminated, water systems destroyed, that had been reclaimed and made productive within a generation. Economic systems that had been completely dismantled by conflict and reconstructed, sometimes better than before, within decades. They were almost impossible to permanently damage. He found a term in their military literature. It described the capacity of a population or a system to absorb damage and continue functioning. The concept existed in most civilizations' military thinking. The idea that some things could take punishment and keep going. But the human version of the concept was different in one key way. For most civilizations, this term described a threshold. A measure of how much damage you could take before you broke. You tried to stay above the threshold. For the humans, the literature treated the threshold not as a ceiling to avoid, but as a floor to build from. They did not plan to stay above the breaking point. They planned for what happened after the breaking point. They had entire strategic frameworks dedicated to the period after catastrophic damage. How to keep fighting. How to keep organizing. How to make the enemy's victory cost more than the enemy wanted to pay, even after the defeat had technically occurred. He thought about this for a long time. He found a word. It described the quality of a thing that bent rather than broke. That absorbed impact and returned to its original shape. Resilience. He looked at it from several angles. He wrote it in his log. Below it he wrote, "This is not a quality they value. This is a quality they have been beaten into. There is a difference." He read it back. He deleted it. He wrote it again. He left it this time. He spent the evening hours on something that was outside his normal survey mandate. He was not sure why he opened the file. He told himself it was for completeness. He told himself all data was relevant data. He pulled their cultural output, their art, their literature, their music, the things they made when they were not making weapons or infrastructure or policy. He scanned through it. There was an enormous amount of it. Centuries of it from every corner of the planet in hundreds of languages and forms. He had no framework for assessing cultural output. It was not part of the survey protocol. He read a piece of writing from a human who had survived one of their large wars. The human described standing in a field where a battle had happened. Described the quiet. Described thinking about the men who had died there. The human did not write about victory. The human did not write about the rightness of the cause or the quality of the weapons or the strength of the army. The human wrote about the quiet field and the names of the dead, most of which the human had already forgotten, and the feeling of standing in a place where something terrible had happened and knowing that the world had simply moved on past it as if it were nothing. Vile 9 read this several times. He had no analytical framework for what he was reading. He put it in a file labeled miscellaneous and moved on. But he did not close the file entirely. He left it open in the background. The way you leave a window cracked without being sure why. He was finishing the technology section of his formal survey report when the notification came in. His scan had been running automated pattern recognition on all outgoing signals from the planet's surface. A standard tool that flagged anything, directed outward rather than inward. It had been running quietly in the background all day. He had almost forgotten it was there. It flagged a signal. He pulled it up. It was the same signal he had detected the night before. Same narrow beam format. Same mathematical language. Same direction. But it had changed. It was not pointing at the approximate last known position of the 11-year-old survey ship anymore. It had adjusted. The new coordinates were pointing at a region of space approximately 40 light-years from Earth. A region he knew. A region the Empire used. A staging area. They had recalculated. They had refined their estimate of where the first ship had come from, using 11 years of accumulated data and whatever mathematics they had available, and they had narrowed the target from a general direction to a specific region. The region was wrong. Off by about 30 light-years from the actual staging area. But it was not randomly wrong. It was systematically wrong in a way that suggested they were working from incomplete information but applying excellent reasoning to it. Given more time and more data, they would narrow it further. He stared at the signal for a long time. They did not know a ship was watching them right now. They did not know where to look for it. But they were looking. They had been looking for 11 years. They were getting closer. He opened his personal log. He typed, "They are not waiting to be found." He thought about that. He typed, "They are looking for us." He saved the log. He opened his formal report. He looked at the threat assessment section. He looked at the number 6. He began to type. He typed, "Assessment ongoing. Additional data required. Soft target confirmation pending further analysis." He sent it. He pulled up the cultural file he had left open in the background. The piece of writing about the quiet field and the forgotten names. He read it once more. He did not know why. He closed it. He kept working. Outside the ship, the planet turned in the dark. 8 billion units going about their lives. 37 wars running. A dozen different governments keeping their hands near their weapons, the way you keep your hand near a door when you are not sure what is on the other side. And somewhere on the surface, a team of humans sat in a room and pointed a narrow beam of mathematics at the stars and waited to see if anything pointed back. Vile 9 did not point anything back. But for the first time in 22 years of surveys, he was not entirely sure he was the one doing the watching. He wrote the full report on the third day. He had been avoiding it. He knew that. He had extended the survey, pulled more data, opened more files, written more entries in his personal log. All of it in some part delay. The protocol did not require a 10-day survey. The protocol required enough data to file a credible threat assessment and an acquisition recommendation. He had enough data. He sat in the analysis chamber and wrote. The official sections went quickly. Population, technology, resource assessment, atmospheric data, infrastructure mapping. These were the easy parts. These were numbers. Numbers did not require courage. He reached the threat assessment narrative. He wrote it twice. The first version was careful. Hedged at every corner. Qualified at every sentence. The kind of writing that could mean almost anything depending on who read it and what they needed it to say. He read it back and deleted it. It was the kind of writing that made him feel like something had gone slightly wrong inside him. The way a machine sounds when one of its components is running at the wrong speed. He wrote the second version plainly. He used the data. He cited the specific figures. The military installation count. The nuclear capacity. The conflict history. The doctrine files. The weapon specifications built to survive conditions their builders could not survive in. He wrote about the resilience patterns. He wrote about the signal his scan had detected. He wrote about the 11 years of systematic observation the humans had already conducted. He did not write his personal log in the report. He did not write about the quiet field or the forgotten names or the word resilience and what it meant that a species could be beaten into a quality rather than born with it. He kept those things in a separate file. But he wrote the truth about the numbers. All of it. At the end of the narrative, he wrote his recommendation. Standard acquisition protocol is not recommended at this time. The target civilization presents a strategic complexity that exceeds current fleet deployment parameters. A full strategic assessment by senior command is recommended before any acquisition timeline is established. He read it back. He sent it. He then opened his personal log and wrote one additional line, separate from everything else, in the kind of bare language that came when you had run out of the energy to make things sound less than they were. I have written the most important report of my career. I do not know if anyone will read it. He closed the log and waited. The report arrived on the desk of his direct supervisor within seconds of being sent. The supervisor read the executive summary. He read it a second time, more slowly. He sat back in his seat on the command deck of the unbroken Meridian and thought about several things at once. He thought about the acquisition timeline that senior command had already attached to this survey. 18 months from initial contact to full resource extraction. A timeline that had been planned before the survey began because the mineral projections had been very compelling and senior command preferred timelines that were established before the data complicated them. He thought about what it would mean to forward this report upward. He thought about the 17 other surveys running simultaneously across the Empire's expansion front, all of them progressing on schedule, all of them moving their target civilizations through the standard pipeline without incident. He forwarded the report to the senior analysis desk with a note that read, "Analyst recommendation included. Review requested." The note was technically accurate. It said nothing about what the recommendation was. The report arrived at the senior analysis desk. The senior analyst had 12 active survey files open at any given time and a method for processing incoming reports that prioritized brevity. He read the executive summary. He scanned the threat assessment narrative. He reached the recommendation and read it twice, the second time with the expression of a person who has found something unexpected in a place they had every reason to expect nothing unexpected. He pulled up the resource assessment section, the mineral projections, the strategic value calculation. He looked at the threat assessment number. 6. Not high. Not even in the upper range. He thought about the recommendation. He thought about the 18-month timeline. He forwarded the report to the Strategic Operations Desk with a note that read, "Analyst flags complexity. Recommend strategic review." He did not include his own opinion of the analyst's recommendation. He had been in this position long enough to know that you did not attach your name to a recommendation that disrupted a timeline that senior command had already blessed. You forwarded it upward and let someone else's name be the one attached to the disruption. The report arrived at the Strategic Operations Desk. The operations director had attended the original briefing where the Earth acquisition timeline had been established. He had been in the room when the resource projections were first presented. He had a memory for the specific quality of a report that could cause problems for a project he was responsible for. He read the full narrative this time. All of it. He was a careful reader. He understood numbers. He understood what the numbers in the report were saying. He sat with it for a while. Then he wrote a response to the survey vessel. Threat assessment noted. Confirms soft target status is achievable. Acquisition timeline remains active. Additional data collection authorized if required for confirmation. He read this back. He added, note, resource value of target remains extremely high. All assessments should factor strategic benefit alongside risk projection. He sent it. He filed the report in a subdirectory of the Earth Acquisition Project folder. 3 levels deep. Under a category marked Supplemental Analysis. He moved the acquisition timeline forward by 2 weeks. Because in his experience, projects that develop complications moved faster when you pushed the timeline tighter rather than slower. Urgency was a very good cure for hesitation. The report would be read by exactly one more person before it was forgotten. That person was a junior aide who was cleaning out the acquisition project folder 18 months later and who came across it in the supplemental analysis subdirectory and who read it with the concentrated attention of someone who was young enough to still be genuinely alarmed by alarming things. The aide forwarded it to his superior with a note that said, "Should we have looked at this more carefully?" His superior sent back a single word, "Irrelevant." By then, of course, a great deal had already happened. On Earth, in a building that did not appear on public maps, in a city that was not important enough to be considered a strategic target by anyone who did not know what the building contained, Commander Addis Okafor stood in front of a display and looked at a blip. The blip had been there for 6 days. It sat at the far edge of the solar system, past the 8th planet, in the cold dark where nothing human had ever traveled. It did not move. It did not transmit anything that her equipment could detect. Whatever it was using to communicate, it was using a method she had not broken yet. But it was there. Her second-in-command stood behind her. He had been standing there for 4 hours. He had the posture of a man who had learned through long experience that sometimes the most useful thing you could do was be present and quiet and ready. He said, "Ma'am." She said, "I see it." He waited. He said, "Orders." She looked at the blip for another moment. Then she turned from the display and walked to the center of the room where a long table held a series of screens showing global status, military deployments, communication channels, the network of quiet preparatory activity that had been running at low intensity for 30 years under the official designation of theoretical contingency planning. "Wake the councils," she said. "All of them." He moved. "Get me the threshold files." He stopped. He turned back. There was something in his face that was not quite fear, but was related to it. The expression of a man who had worked toward a moment for 30 years and had somehow, despite everything, never fully believed it would arrive. "Yes, ma'am." He left. She stood at the table and looked at the global status screens for a long time. She was 54 years old. She had spent 30 years in the section of the military that officially did not exist, doing the work that officially was not being done, preparing for a scenario that was officially theoretical. 30 years of quiet, careful, deliberate preparation in the margins of a defense establishment that had for most of that time preferred to keep the margins small. She had a daughter, 7 years old. She was in school today, learning mathematics and how to read maps. She did not know what her mother did. She thought her mother worked in government, which was technically correct. "Not this Tuesday." Okafor put her hand flat on the table. "Not this Tuesday" was not a prayer. It was a deadline. The most specific deadline she had ever set herself. It had a body count attached to it and a detailed operational plan and 30 years of accumulated preparation behind it. Not this Tuesday meant she had work to do. And the work was not finished yet. And the blip at the edge of the solar system was going to wait until she was ready. She took her hand off the table. She sat down. She opened the preliminary threshold file on the screen in front of her. The threshold files were 40 years old at their core. Older than Okafor's career. Older than most of the military technology they referenced. Created by a group of people in several different countries who had looked at the history of human civilization and asked a simple question: what if the next threat is not from here? The people who asked the question had been careful. They had framed everything as theoretical. They had worked through official channels where they could, through informal ones where they could not. They had built a framework quietly, piece by piece, over 4 decades. Keeping it updated as technology changed and doctrine evolved. Adding new contributors in each generation who were read into the project under increasingly elaborate cover designations. Okafor had been read into the project at age 24. She had devoted 30 years to it. The framework had a simple central premise. We do not know what they have. We do know what we have. We cannot match them at their strengths. So we make them fight at ours. The files did not assume victory. They never had. The people who built them were too honest for that. What they assumed was cost. Specifically, they assumed that any hostile civilization capable of interstellar travel would be operating on a resource calculus. That the decision to acquire a planet was ultimately an economic decision. And that economic decisions could be made and profitable. You did not have to win. You had to make winning cost more than it was worth. Okafor had spent 30 years turning this premise into something operational. A specific, detailed, globally coordinated doctrine for making the acquisition of Earth a transaction that no rational empire would choose to complete. She knew it was not perfect. She knew there were scenarios where it failed. She had run those scenarios many times. She had lost sleep over some of them. But she had also run the scenario where nothing had been prepared, where humanity met its first contact with 30 years less work behind it, with the threshold files still theoretical and the council still asleep and the global coordination network still informal. She preferred the current scenario. Hassan returned. He set a physical drive on the table beside her screen. The threshold files in their complete form, accessed through a system that was not connected to any external network. Some things you kept behind walls that nothing could reach through. He said, the councils are responding. Most should be patched in within the hour. She nodded. He hesitated. Do you think it's a scout? She looked at the blip on the main display. Steady. Patient. Not moving. Yes. Do you think they know we've spotted them? No. Should we tell them we have? She was quiet for a moment. Not yet. Hassan stood there. He was a careful man and a smart one, and she valued him precisely because he asked questions instead of waiting to be told things. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, she said, that the most important intelligence we have right now is that they don't know what we know. That's worth more than anything else we've got. So we sit on it. He nodded slowly. She said, I'm also thinking that whoever is on that ship has been watching us for almost a week and hasn't called for a fleet yet. That could mean they don't think we're a threat. Or it could mean that whoever is doing the watching is smarter than the people giving the orders. She said this without satisfaction. It was not a hopeful thought. A smart watcher filing reports that were not being read was a situation she recognized. She had spent 30 years filing reports that were not being read by the people who should have been reading them. She picked up the physical drive. She held it for a moment. Get me a global read on military readiness. Full spectrum. I want numbers in 20 minutes. She set the drive down. And Youssef, tell the councils this is not a drill. But tell them I know we've said that before. She looked at the display. The blip, steady in the dark. Tell them this time I need them to mean it. He left. She opened the threshold files and started reading from the beginning. The way she always did when she needed to remember why 30 years of work in the margins of official reality had been worth exactly what it cost. The building hummed around her. Outside its walls, the city went about its ordinary Tuesday. Traffic and weather and people on their way to somewhere else. A planet of 8 billion who did not know a ship was watching them from the edge of their solar system. Okafor read. The blip sat at the edge of the solar system, not moving. Both of them waited. High Emissary Sorith had done this 41 times. He reminded himself of this as his shuttle descended through the atmosphere of the third planet. 41 first contacts. 41 ceremonies. 41 civilizations that had looked up at the Empire's ships and understood, in the specific way that all civilizations eventually understood, that the shape of the universe had just changed around them and there was nothing left to do but decide how gracefully they stepped through the door being opened for them. He was very good at this. The Empire did not send second-rate personnel to conduct first contact ceremonies. The ceremony was important. It set the tone for the acquisition. A ceremony done well made everything that followed easier. The cooperation. The resource extraction. The gradual integration into the Empire's broader structure. A ceremony done poorly created friction. And friction cost money and time and occasionally lives. And the Empire disliked all three. Sorith had never done a ceremony poorly. He adjusted his collar. Ceremonial fabric. Deep blue. The color the Empire used for official diplomatic occasions because analysis across hundreds of civilizations had found it to be reliably perceived as calm and authoritative. The shuttle broke through the cloud layer. Below him, the planet was very green, very blue, covered in light cloud that moved in long, slow patterns across the land masses. Beautiful in the way that living worlds were always beautiful from a certain altitude, before you descended far enough to see the details. He saw the scars from here. The places where the land was marked by old conflict, old fire, old construction and destruction laid on top of each other in layers. The world wore its history on its surface, the way some people wore their years on their faces openly, without apparent embarrassment. He noted this and moved on. The designated meeting point was a flat area outside a mid-sized city on the northern continent. The coordinates had been transmitted through the same mathematical signal language the humans had been using to communicate outward. The Empire had recognized it immediately and responded through the same channel. The exchange had been brief and formal. Arrival time, location, number of personnel, the minimum vocabulary of an appointment being made. The humans had agreed to the location without counterproposal. Sorith had found this mildly encouraging. Civilizations that tried to change the meeting location were usually trying to gain some small tactical advantage. Agreeing immediately suggested cooperation, or it suggested that they had no preference because the location did not matter to them. He had not fully decided which interpretation he preferred. The shuttle set down. Sorith waited the appropriate 3 seconds, long enough to indicate composure, short enough to indicate confidence, and then descended the ramp. He saw her immediately. One person standing on a low platform that had been set up in advance. His people had arranged the platform. She had simply stepped onto it as if it had been there for other reasons and she had found it convenient. She wore a dark coat. Simple. Slightly too large for her, in the way of a garment that had been grabbed in a hurry. Though he did not think it had been grabbed in a hurry. He thought it had been chosen very deliberately to look like it had been grabbed in a hurry. No honor guard. No display of weapons or military personnel. He could see figures at the perimeter, distant, not aggressive, positioned more like observers than defenders. She had come alone to the platform. He looked at her face. She was looking at his shuttle with the expression of a person watching a bus arrive. Specifically a bus that was running slightly late and for which she had been waiting long enough to have moved past anticipation into the quieter country of simply waiting. He walked toward her. She watched him cover the distance without changing her expression. He stopped at the appropriate ceremonial distance. Far enough to indicate respect for her space. Close enough to indicate this was a conversation and not a transmission. He gave the opening greeting in his own language, then its translated form, then the mathematical bridge language they had been using in the signal exchange. Moving through all three the way he always did at first contact. Establishing the baseline of communication before proceeding. She let him finish. Then she said, "I appreciate the welcome." He processed this. "I'm sure you do," she said. Her voice had the quality of a person who spoke carefully, not because they were uncertain, but because they had decided that precision was more efficient than volume. She was looking at him with a directness that he noted. Most first contact counterparts looked slightly past him, or at his collar, or at the shuttle behind him. She was looking at his face. Specifically at the area around his eyes, which in his species was where most involuntary expression occurred. She was reading him. He proceeded to the opening address. He had given it 41 times. It was a good address. It spoke of the Empire's history. 2,000 years of expansion. 800 worlds integrated. The combined knowledge and resources of hundreds of civilizations working in coordination. It described the process of integration. The way a newly acquired world moved through stages, first contact to full membership, and what each stage involved and what it offered. It described the alternatives briefly, in the measured tone of someone describing weather rather than making threats. He spoke for approximately 4 minutes. She listened without moving, without nodding, without the small behavioral signals that most species use to indicate they were processing and following. She stood still and listened with her full attention. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We've had a chance to look at your fleet composition." He did not react. He was very good at not reacting. She reached into her coat and took out a small flat device. She looked at it. She read from it. Fleet designation. Ship classes. Approximate weapon load per vessel. Deployment formation at current position. A position that was supposed to be classified at a level his own junior personnel did not have access to. She read the numbers in the tone of someone reading a grocery list. When she finished, she set the device down at her side. "You've got good material," she said. "We've had worse Tuesdays." He stood in the quiet of the open ground and felt the ceremony shifting under him. The way ground feels before it moves. He recalibrated. This was what he was trained for. Civilizations that pushed back in the early stages required a different approach. Firmer framing. Clearer consequence. He moved to the second phase of the script. He spoke about what resistance to the acquisition process had historically cost civilizations at this development stage. He was precise about it. He used numbers, because numbers were honest and the second phase worked best when it was honest. He described the fleet that would follow the initial contact mission. He described its size and its capability. He was not unkind. He was clear. She listened. When he finished, she said, "Can I show you something?" She did not wait for his answer. The platform beside her activated a display surface that had been built into it, which he had taken on first inspection to be a decorative element. It was not decorative. It showed a tactical summary, dense with figures and projections and positional data. He looked at it for a long time. It was an analysis of his fleet, not just the composition she had already described. This was deeper. This was a projected engagement model. It took the Empire's fleet as it was currently deployed and ran it against a set of Earth-based responses. At the bottom, it produced a column of numbers that he recognized immediately as casualty projections and cost estimates. The projections were not favorable to the Empire, not catastrophically unfavorable. He had the fleet advantage, the technology advantage, the sheer weight of an empire that had conquered 800 worlds. The model acknowledged this. But it did not claim the humans could win a direct engagement. It did not pretend the numbers were anything other than what they were. It showed, with the cold clarity of math that had clearly been worked on by very careful people for a very long time, the specific point at which the cost of the acquisition exceeded the value of the acquisition. It showed how the humans intended to reach that point. Not through victory. Through a specific, calculated kind of loss that kept costing the attacker money and ships and personnel long past the point where a normal civilization would have stopped. It showed 37 different variations of this calculation. Each one accounted for a different scenario, different fleet sizes, different attack vectors, different timelines. Each one ended at the same place. The math problem said, "Here is how expensive we intend to be." He looked at her. She was watching him read. She was not looking at the display. She was watching his face, specifically the area around his eyes again, reading whatever she could find there. He said, "You've prepared for this. For us. Specifically. We've been preparing for something like you for a long time," she said. "The shape of the problem is pretty consistent." "What problem?" She looked at him. Not warm. Not cold either. The look of a person who is describing a fact that has been true long enough to stop feeling like news. "Someone always comes," she said. He stood with that. Someone always comes. He had conducted 41 first contact ceremonies. He had stood in front of 41 civilizations and delivered the opening address and moved through the phases of the ceremony and watched 41 sets of leaders arrive at the understanding of their situation. He had seen fear and grief and anger and despair and occasionally a specific kind of exhausted relief, the relief of civilizations that had been struggling alone for so long that the arrival of something larger felt, in some awful way, like company. He had never stood in front of a civilization that had been expecting him. Not him specifically. He understood that. But the category of him. The kind of him. The thing he represented. An outside force arriving with resources and intent and a specific expectation about what was going to happen next. They had looked at the history of their own planet. They had looked at the pattern. And they had said, if it keeps happening here, it probably happens out there too. And if it happens out there, it will eventually happen to us. And they had started preparing. He thought about the 40-year-old framework her intelligence service had described to him in a briefing summary he had been handed before the ceremony. A briefing summary that his own intelligence team had been alarmed to find existed, because its existence meant the humans had a level of strategic coordination that was not supposed to be present in a Category 4 pre-contact civilization. He thought about what it meant that they had been working on this for 40 years. He thought about the signal they had been directing outward for 11 years. The one that had been quietly narrowing in on the Empire's position. He thought about the way she was standing, still unhurried, as if she had as much time as she needed because she had already done the time-sensitive work, and what remained was simply this conversation. He said, "Your analysis of our fleet." "Yes." "The numbers at the bottom." "Yes." "You understand what they mean." "They mean," she said, "that winning is expensive. And we intend to make sure you know the price before you decide whether you want to pay it." He was quiet. She was quiet. The wind moved across the open ground between them. Behind her, somewhere in the middle distance, he could hear the sounds of the city. Traffic. Voices. The low, continuous hum of 8 billion lives going about their business. He had the peculiar feeling of standing at the edge of something very large without being able to see the bottom of it. "You're not asking us to leave," he said. "No. I'm asking you to recalculate." "I'm showing you a math problem," she said. "What you do with it is up to you." He thought about the ceremony, the script, the phases. He thought about the 41 times it had worked and the specific quality of the confidence he had boarded the shuttle with. The well-maintained confidence of a professional who had never had his tools fail him. The tools were still there. The ceremony still existed. He could proceed to the third phase and the fourth and the fifth. He could summon the fleet. He could proceed exactly as the protocol dictated. The math problem would still be sitting at the bottom of the display when he did. He said, "I need 48 hours. She looked at him. Something moved in her face. Not surprise. Not satisfaction. A very small shift that might have been, if he was reading her correctly, a particular kind of recognition. The recognition of a professional watching another professional arrive at the same conclusion from a different direction. "Granted," she said. He turned and walked back toward the shuttle. He kept his posture correct, his pace measured, his expression composed. He had 41 ceremonies behind him, and he knew how to leave a space well. But he was thinking about the bottom of that display. The number at the end of 37 different calculations. The same number 37 times. He was thinking about what it meant that they had run 37 scenarios. That they had that many scenarios ready. That someone, or many someones, had sat in a room across many years and imagined 37 different ways this conversation might go and prepared a mathematical response to each one. He was thinking about the old text. The one several thousand years old that Vial 9 had mentioned in the report that Sorith had pulled from the supplemental subdirectory during the transit to Earth. He had read Vial 9's report on the shuttle. All of it. He had not told anyone on his team that he had read it. The text said, "Know your enemy." He was beginning to understand, walking back across the open ground in the wind of a world that was not his, that for the first time in 41 ceremonies, he was the one who had arrived without having read the relevant material. He reached the shuttle. He stepped inside. He closed the door behind him. His protocol officer looked at him with the particular expression of someone waiting to be told that everything had gone as expected. Sorith sat down in the transit seat. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up. "Get me a full relay to command," he said. "Priority channel." "Yes, emissary." "How shall I characterize the contact for the transmission header?" He thought about this. "Complicated," he said. The protocol officer did not know what to do with this. He typed it anyway. The shuttle rose from the platform. Through the small port window, Sorith watched the woman on the platform get smaller as they climbed. She did not watch the shuttle leave. She had already turned back to her display. She had more work to do. He found that he was not surprised. He sat in the shuttle and thought about the number 37, and the math problem, and the old text, and the 40 years of preparation, and the 11 years of observation, and the word she had used. Someone always comes. He tried to find the category in his professional experience that fit what had happened on that platform. He could not find it. That was also, he realized, something she had probably anticipated. The command chamber on the Empire's regional flagship was a cold room. Not in temperature. The climate systems maintained a comfortable and consistent atmospheric envelope throughout the vessel. Cold in the way that rooms used for certain kinds of decisions became cold. The way a surface becomes smooth from being touched by the same hands in the same way too many times. Four senior strategists sat at the round table. High Emissary Sorith stood at the head of it. He had prepared his debrief carefully during the transit back from Earth. He had thought about what he was going to say. More precisely, he had thought about the gap between what he knew and what this room could hear. The gap between truth as he had experienced it on that platform in the wind of the third planet, and truth in the form that these four people, with their specific histories and their specific investments in the current acquisition timeline, were capable of receiving. He had closed that gap as much as he could. He was not sure he had closed it enough. He delivered the debrief. He spoke for 20 minutes. He covered the contact in full. The platform. The woman. The data she had shown him. The fleet analysis she had presented. The 37 scenarios. The cost projections. The mathematical argument that she had set in front of him without hostility, without theater, with the same matter-of-fact clarity with which you might set a bill on a table. He watched the faces at the table as he spoke. The four strategists had the particular quality of very senior officials during a briefing. Attentive in a managed way. The attention curated. Turned on and off like a tool. They were present for the parts they needed. They were elsewhere for the parts that complicated things. He reached the recommendation section. He said, "The acquisition cost projection has changed significantly." He displayed the numbers Okafor had shown him, reframed in the Empire's own accounting language. The language of resource value, operational cost, projected personnel loss, material attrition across the full engagement timeline. He had done this translation carefully during the transit. Her numbers were good. He had checked them against his own ship's tactical databases and found that where she had made assumptions, her assumptions were conservative rather than generous. She had not inflated the projected costs. She had, if anything, underestimated them. The room looked at the numbers. The eldest strategist, Commander Seltar, who had been present at the original briefing where the Earth acquisition had been proposed and who had been the one to bless the 18-month timeline, looked at the numbers for a long time. "These are their numbers," she said. "They are accurate," Sorith said. "I've verified them against our own tactical data." Seltar was quiet. Sorith had known her for 11 years. He had seen her in many rooms processing many pieces of information. He knew the specific quality of her silence that meant she was angry, and the specific quality that meant she was thinking, and the specific quality that meant she had already made a decision and was now deciding how to announce it. He continued before she could speak. "I am not recommending withdrawal. I am recommending reclassification. Category 4 is not accurate for this civilization. The correct category requires a new designation." The youngest strategist spoke. "What designation?" "One that reflects the correct strategic complexity." "Which is what?" Sorith looked at him. "They have been at war with themselves for 10,000 years. They have nuclear weapons and have had them for 81 years and have not destroyed themselves. They have active conflict running on 37 fronts on a single continent. They have military installations that number in the thousands. They have weapons designed to function after a nuclear detonation within 5 kilometers of the user." He paused. "And they have spent 40 years building a specific strategic doctrine for this exact scenario. Not a general defense posture. Not a standard planetary defense system. A specific, coordinated, globally unified doctrine designed for a first contact acquisition attempt by a technologically superior civilization." The room was quiet. "They were expecting us," Sorith said. "Not us specifically. The category of us. And they used the time before we arrived to prepare." Seltar said, "Every world prepares some form of defense." "No," Sorith said simply. "They don't. I have conducted 41 first contacts. I have never stood in front of a civilization that had run 37 scenarios for the conversation I was about to have with them." The room sat with this. Seltar said, "The resource value remains extremely high." "It does," Sorith said. "The strategic benefit of the acquisition remains significant." "It does. Then what precisely is the recommendation?" Sorith thought about the woman on the platform. The math problem on the display. The specific quality of her stillness. Not passive. Not resigned. The stillness of someone who had already done the preparatory work and was now simply present for the outcomes of it. He thought about the old text. Know your enemy. He thought about what she had said. Someone always comes. The recommendation, he said, is that we do not proceed under the assumption that this is a standard acquisition. The recommendation is that we recognize what we are looking at and decide with full information what we want to do about it. He looked at Celtar. I am not telling this room what to do. I am telling this room what I saw. And what I saw was a civilization that has been sharpened by its own history into something that does not have a direct equivalent in our taxonomy. They are not Category 4. They are not Category 7. They are something we haven't named yet. The room was very quiet. The youngest strategist said quietly, to no one in particular, "What do we call them?" Sorith did not answer. He did not need to. The word was already in the room. It had been in the room since he put the numbers on the display. The 4 people at the table were all senior enough and experienced enough to have recognized it when it arrived. Even if none of them wanted to be the first to say it aloud. The word was one the Empire used rarely. One it reserved for civilizations that had earned a specific kind of standing. Not through size or technology or political power. Through a demonstrated capacity to make the Empire's standard methods inappropriate. The word was peer. Celtar looked at the display for a long time. Then she said, strategic review. 90 days. She looked at Sorith. Acquisition timeline is suspended pending review. She did not say you were right. She did not say the original assessment was wrong. She said, dismissed. Sorith left the room. The 4 strategists sat in the cold chamber and looked at the numbers on the display and did not speak for a while. Vial 9 received the notification on the unbroken meridian 2 days later. Acquisition timeline suspended. Strategic review ordered. Your survey vessel to hold position pending further instruction. He read it. He read it again. He sat in the analysis chamber and looked at the notification for a while. He opened his personal log. He had been keeping it for 22 years. It was the longest document he had ever written. It was also the most honest one, which was not something he had intended when he started it. It had become honest gradually, over many surveys and many worlds, in the way that private writing becomes honest when no one is reading it. He typed for a long time. The acquisition order has been suspended pending strategic review. The review will take time. Long enough, probably, for them to continue the preparations they have been making for 40 years. I believe this is what they intended when she showed him the math problem. Not to frighten him away. To buy time. He paused. I reviewed their history one final time before closing the survey file. I was looking for the thing I missed. The soft part. The place in the record where they stopped or rested or decided that what they had built was enough and they could set the building down. I did not find it. He read this back. I found something else instead. In one of their older conflicts, not the largest one, not the most famous one of the middle-sized ones that their historians record in the long lists of wars the way you record items in an inventory, I found a term. It was used by a military theorist writing in the aftermath of that particular war. A theorist who had lost the war, which may be why the thinking in the text had a specific quality of clarity that winning tends to obscure. The term described a strategy. The strategy was this: you could not always win a direct engagement. You could not always prevent the enemy from taking ground or destroying your assets or advancing on your position. But you could make the act of advancing so expensive, in personnel, in material, in time, in the slow drain of a campaign that never ended, that the enemy ran out of the will to continue before you ran out of the capacity to resist. Not victory. Something the theorist called attrition. He sat with the word. They have an entire science of it. They have had it for 4,000 years. Possibly longer. The term is that old and the concept is older than the term. He closed the survey file. He did not file it in the recycling queue. He moved it to the primary archive under a new designation. He looked at the designation he had given it. A single notation that was outside the standard taxonomy. Not a category number. A word. Ongoing. He closed the log. He sat in the analysis chamber and looked at the planet on his display. Still turning. Still lit on the night side. Still running its 37 conflicts. Still building. Still repairing. Still pointing a narrow signal beam at the stars with the patient, deliberate energy of a species that had learned somewhere in its long and brutal history that the most important thing was not to stop. He did not know what the strategic review would conclude. He did not know if the Empire would return with a larger fleet or a different approach or a negotiating posture or nothing at all. He did not know if the review would arrive at the word he had not said aloud in the command chamber. He did not know if any of it would matter. What he knew was the thing that had taken him 6 days of survey data and 22 years of professional experience and a personal log that had become something he had not intended. He knew this. There was no soft part. There had never been a soft part. Whatever softness the species had once possessed, the 10,000 years of its own history had worked on it the way water works on stone. Patiently. Continuously. Without interruption. Until what remained was something else entirely. Something that looked from a distance like a world, like a Category 4 pre-contact civilization with limited technology and a lot of internal conflict, and was up close something that did not yet have a name in any language he spoke. He sat with this for a long time. Then he pulled up the cultural file he had never fully closed. The piece of writing about the quiet field and the forgotten names. The human who had stood in the place where the battle had been and thought about the dead and written about the world moving on. He read it again. He still did not have an analytical framework for it. He put it in the primary archive next to the survey file marked ongoing. Okafor was in her office when Hassan told her. He came in without knocking, which meant it was important. The fleet has moved to holding position, he said. Long-range scan confirms no advance movement. There's a general broadcast on the contact channel. Standard diplomatic frequency. The same one Sorith used. She looked up from the file she had been reading. What does it say? Strategic review. 90 days minimum. They're asking for a formal communication channel to remain open. She looked at him. That tracks, she said. She stood up. She went to the window. The city was bright in the afternoon. Ordinary. Unhurried. Doing what cities did on days when nothing officially remarkable was happening. Hassan said, 90 days. 90 days, she agreed. And after that? She looked at the sky. Up past the buildings. Past the weather. Past the ordinary afternoon. Somewhere up there, past everything visible, a fleet sat at the edge of her solar system and did math. After that, she said, we find out how good their math is. She did not say it with fear. She did not say it with satisfaction. She said it the way you state a fact about weather. Descriptively. Without investment in whether the weather was what you wanted. Hassan stood beside her for a moment. He said, do you think they'll come back? She thought about Sorith. About the way he had looked at the display. About the specific quality of his silence when he had read the numbers. Not the silence of a man deciding whether to be frightened. The silence of a professional recalibrating in real time. Understanding something he had not fully understood before. Yes, she said. But differently. She turned from the window. Her daughter was coming to visit that afternoon. She had arranged it a week ago. Before the blip appeared at the edge of the solar system. Before the councils were woken. Before the threshold files came off the secure drive and became operational rather than theoretical. She had arranged it because her daughter was 7 and the visits were getting harder to schedule, and she had a rule, not official, not written down anywhere, but real, that certain things did not get cancelled for work. She picked up her coat from the hook beside the door. Hassan said, there's still the coordination brief at 1600. I'll be back by 15:30, she said. She put the coat on. She looked at the display one last time. The blip, holding position. Steady in the dark at the edge of everything. Keep the channel open, she said. Keep the councils at readiness. And then get me an updated analysis on the fleet composition for the morning brief. She buttoned the coat. We have 90 days. Let's use them. She left the office. The building hummed around her as she walked the corridor toward the exit. The screens on the wall showed global status. Readiness levels. Communication channels. The quiet machinery of 30 years of preparation holding steady at the level she had asked it to hold. Green across the board. The way she had needed it to be. She walked out into the afternoon. The city was loud and warm and full of people who did not know what had happened in the last 6 days and would not know for some time yet. A child ran past her on the pavement, chasing something. A man was arguing on a phone. Somewhere down the block, music was coming out of an open window. She walked 3 blocks to the school. Her daughter was waiting at the gate. 7 years old. A coat slightly too big for her because she had grown since September and the replacement coat was still on order. She was carrying a drawing she had done in class, held flat in both hands carefully, the way children carry things they are proud of. Okafor crouched down. "What did you make?" Her daughter held out the drawing. It was a picture of space. Dark background. Stars made of crayon, yellow and white. And in the center, a small blue circle. Recognizable in the way that a child's drawing of a beloved thing is always recognizable. Not precise, but true. Just Earth. No ships. No fleet at the edge. No blip in the dark. Just the planet. Small and blue and drawn with a particular careful love of someone who is still at the age where the world is the size of the things you can see. Okafor looked at it for a moment. "It's beautiful," she said. Her daughter beamed. They walked home through the ordinary afternoon. The drawing held between them. The city loud and warm and continuous around them. And above it all, past the weather and the sky and the long dark between stars, a fleet held its position and ran its numbers and decided what a civilization was worth. Okafor held her daughter's hand and walked. She was not afraid. Whether that was the bravest thing about her or the most damaged, the story does not say. It leaves that in the reader's hands, where it has always belonged.